All right. Welcome to another great discussion here on the XExamine podcast. We're going to start off with an interesting question. If gold isn't money, why are central banks around the world buying it? If they
It's really
have,
weird. I feel like they've told us over and over again that gold isn't something we should worry about. And all of a sudden we see them filling their pockets with this shit. So what's going on?
like, hey, you don't have to worry about that. And if you don't, then it's free for us to gobble up and stockpile.
It's like you're watching a 4-year-old with a cookie behind their mouth, behind their back, chocolate smeared all over their mouth, telling you that they have no idea where the cookies went.
The most ingenious idea was to be able to turn my printer on, print things that I say have value, and then buy real assets with paper.
Paper. Doesn't paper grow on trees?
I
Isn't that the one
think
place they told me money doesn't come from?
yeah, I think a lot of it's made from cotton. Some of it's just plastic, and then they put a few strips of hard to counterfeit metal strips or something through it. That way, we can believe that it has value because so many people want to counterfeit it, but we don't realize that we're all playing into this very interesting schematic where it's kind of nebulously corresponding to something that, because a higher institution told us has value, as long as enough people just kind of buy into it, then it can kind of work for a system, except that there are all these powerful actors in the background using that and giving it away, telling people that it has all this legendary and magical attributes, and then buying real assets with it, like gold, which seems to be really coming to the forefront of the financial markets with you have countries like India, Ghana, they're now going to, or have been, buying oil with gold instead of US dollars. Saudi Arabia is trying to get in on this action as well. You have China and Russia buying gold and buying oil with that gold then. And it's weird that they're using gold as the medium of exchange if it's not money,
It's
meaning it
fascinating
is
that they're not
money.
using it's fascinating that they're not using something that so many people online have told me is superior, like Bitcoin or even like the good old US dollar. Now, why wouldn't those pieces of fiat be equal than something physical and heavy like gold, something that exists in the real world that cannot easily be replicated? I mean, hell, we have a whole mythology on the what people think of as the philosopher's stone, which actually uses a different type of powder, if I remember correctly. The Philosopher's Stone is, one of those
From Harry Potter?
alchemaic. Well, it existed before Harry
Oh,
Potter.
oh, that's the Sorcerer's Stone. Never mind. The Philosopher's Stone.
It's they're all similar anyway. But
Yeah,
yeah, the
don't hate me, Harry Potter fans. I misremembered the stone, their sacred stone.
if you have multiple mythologies throughout the course of human history that involve things turning into gold, gold being the source of all pleasure and happiness, and people dedicating their entire life to the alchemic transformation of lesser metals into quote unquote higher metals, then we have to ask ourselves, what the hell is going on with gold that makes it so valuable?
And this is making me think of a very small, uh, creeping idea that seems to be coming up. And I'm going to squash it right now, which is, oh, well, why aren't people using diamonds? And that's because you can just burn a diamond. A diamond is made of carbon. So people think of like a diamond as like a really strong substance, which it is. It has some interesting industry applications, but the market is completely controlled. The supply is controlled. That way the value can stay high. So anybody that thinks that they're obligated to buy this large wedding ring, they're just paying this inflated price for something that is 100% able to be synthetically produced. They can just be made in a lab, diamonds. And You can burn them. You can burn a diamond. It's made of carbon, and it you will be left with nothing. When you go to you know, a pile of rubble or something, you're gonna find gold bars if they were there before the fire. They will stand the they will withstand the fire just like they've withstood the test of time as a store of value for at least the last 5,000 years. Those shiny metal bricks.
There are numerous reasons why gold is superior to not only diamonds, but a lot of other commodities as a form of money, which is why that aspect of it makes it valuable. It's valuable because what we want from the conditions that satisfy what makes good money are present and found in gold and silver and precious metals, even including like palladium and rhodium, even though they're not quite as popular. Gold and silver have that extra element of being historically popular, which makes them like great targets for not only our current, if we want to regain stability inside our current markets, we would be wise to adopt more gold and silver transacting mediums. So what makes gold and silver so great is that they're more or less uniform when melted. They don't have as many isotopes. Actually, I don't even think gold has a naturally occurring isotope found on Earth that is different. I could be wrong there, but there's either only one isotope that we deal with or like a very limited pool of isotopes that we deal with. So like it's homogeneous. That's a great aspect to gold. That's homogeneous, and you can make bricks out of it. You can make coins. It's very easy to do. Diamonds, on the other hand, they have an increasing amount of value due to their size. That's not like you can just bust up a diamond and glue a bunch of them back together, and then you'll have an equal amount of diamond. That you have the world's largest diamond is way more valuable than the same amount of diamonds in smaller amounts added together.
That was all
So
very well described. And yeah, gold, when you come back to it, it'll be the same gold. Like I can't go to some I don't know, I can't pull a time capsule out of the ground in Germany and pull out their marks, and then those marks don't have the same value. But if somebody had put like a gold or silver coin in there, that's this it still holds value throughout time. You have gold that can't be corroded, so it can be used in electronics, huge technological value as well. If you're looking at like an industry application, as well as silver, I believe silver is the most highly conducting substance that we have. So it can be, it's currently used for things like Tesla cars for their battery components. So silver can be, it has a lot of industry application as well as there's probably a contributing factor to its store of value. I don't know much about platinum and palladium other than they're also valuable metals. And because they are finite resources, that's what makes them have value is the scarcity, which is the whole idea behind why anything has a lot of value. It's because it's finite, and yes, you could pull more out of the ground, but it's an energy intensive process. So that's a big distinguishing factor between having to set up a mining company and refinement, like actually figuring out where the veins are in the ground versus me hitting send to printer and then print it and then printing out a bunch of things that I ascribe value to. It's almost like a
absolutely.
rumor. It's like the best rumor in the world. If I say so and so was messing around with this girl in school or something, you tell enough people, a few people will believe it. So hey, this check out these monopoly dollars. You can use these. And everybody's like, I don't think so. But if you hear it from enough people, then you might think that that's true.
Absolutely. I think unfortunately that's the case with Bitcoin. Um, and I'm not saying that Bitcoin is, this terrible plague that you need to keep all of your family and friends away from. But what I will say about Bitcoin is that it's still not quite as good as being like born in the heart of a star and, having found in random pockets all across your planet. there's something about the centralized nature of the creation of Bitcoin, despite its, eventual decentralized distribution, that anyone can more or less copy. I mean, like, you can copy Bitcoin and it won't be Bitcoin, but it will be, more or less the same. It won't be the original Bitcoin, but you could, theoretically put the same program on different servers and have exactly the same thing being propagated around. And it won't play nice with itself. And it won't play nice with anything else. But, there's a certain amount of you could say unrealness that comes with the fact that it could be so easily generated.
That is an interesting dissection. I do still believe that it has a lot of value. You raise some really good points, though, especially with the reproducibility. There's not a barrier to reproducing it, but there is a barrier to adoption, which is you have to convince enough people to make the switch to the other one. And but this is interesting because it also reminds me, it's almost like an intellectual property argument where if I had the power to, like if I walked into a grocery and I looked at an apple and I opened my hand and I was able to reorganize atoms and molecules and synthesize an apple in my hand, if I walk out with this apple and eat it, did I steal an apple? And because I use the processing power and I use my resources to replicate the apple, I would say that I did not steal an apple, but IP and intellectual property rights would say, well, you made a digital copy, and that is piracy, and piracy is theft. But I would argue that theft removes the original, piracy makes a copy of the original. And so you could copy Bitcoin, and that is an interesting distinguishing factor because gold, I have to go get my own gold. And even then, like now we both have gold and they both have value. Whereas if there's like a competitor to Bitcoin, they are competing for a market. Gold is not necessarily like that. Maybe people could say like, oh, gold competes with silver, but I don't actually think that that's true. So it's like a lot harder to divide up the gold into very small portions. Maybe there's a way to do it that we can talk about. Actually, you did mention a way that it might be possible with gold backs, and silver
Right.
might be able to be the kind of the second layer of the exchange, the physical exchange layer, with gold kind of being like the bank account, the accounting of the assets.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, if we look at the system in total, we're talking here about something that in itself has value because it is a unique chemical property. Gold has a certain proton and electron, neutron configuration that makes it what it is. And this we cannot replicate as of right now in labs on scale to make it in a way that it would cease to function as good money. And so I think that what we're talking about here also sort of begs the question of like, why do we need certain types of money? Why do we use money? And this kind of will let us distinguish between something that's representative of value, like dollars, like Bitcoin, and something that is a commodity itself, which is gold. So when I'm talking about like commodity transactions, I'm really glad that you gave those excellent counter examples with Bitcoin too, because I would also say that like Bitcoin, you could have a layered tiered system of fiat. Then you could say that Bitcoin is a superior form of fiat when you compare it to other things like, you know, paper dollars, or even banking systems that do not have electronic backbone and they're still like using, let's just say like a general ledger that's made by hand, written by candlelight. You have different layers of protection that aren't quite as powerful, as you would see. So like going back to transacting gold, I think a lot of people would conflate this erroneously with it being unprogressive, that we are regressing to a prior form. of transacting. Whereas I think in today's digital age, the tools that allow us for verification actually make gold a greater asset to have. It's a lot easier to figure out gold purity. We've really, gone through the groundwork of figuring out how to analyze purity from that aspect, and also our transportation methods are superior, and our methods of security are superior in multiple ways too, involving security cameras and even the way that guards are trained and set up. So I think we're working in a different paradigm, which does not necessarily make it regressive, but instead offers a superior way of moving forward.
I like this. I'm thinking about a very interesting idea where we could combine those two, kind of based off of our earlier idea that you and I had spoken about, a gold-backed Bitcoin standard, where because you cannot increase or decrease the supply of Bitcoin, besides losing your private keys or losing your seed phrase and losing access to your Bitcoin, in a way, so we can't trust most fiat because governments can't keep their hand out of the cookie jar, and they want to print money, and they want that Cantillon effect where they're going to help out their buddies, or just out of almost moral vulnerability, where they, oh, we just, I see people suffering, so if they just had a little bit more money, not realizing that they're actually doing a disservice to the people that they're serving by increasing the supply without also increasing the value that they should be corresponding to. So if you look up like any chart of like any currency, but specifically like US dollar value over time, you'll see like $1 was worth $1 in 1913 when the Federal Reserve was created. And then it's lost 95% of its purchasing power by the time 2013 comes around. And now we've had just an insane amount of printing since then. So it's probably worth 3%, maybe 2% of its original purchasing power. So we can't trust the centrally controlled organizations to manage the value of that dollar, or the corresponding worth over time, because there are so many factors that will just inevitably result in a loss of purchasing power over time. But that doesn't mean that centralization is bad. And what I'm thinking here is it's a centrally accounted for value system, which is just the total amount of gold that people have. So that is a single number, all the gold that people have. And then decentralized blockchain ledgers where everybody is able to audit other ledgers as much as they want. And there's always this consensus sequence that will identify and expose and reject ledgers that are not in agreement with everyone else's ledgers if they're trying to double spend money, or they're cooking the books and there's some sort of weird accounting going on because they're trying to take advantage of the system, which obviously there will be people who do it, but that's why the consensus mechanism is so successful with how Bitcoin currently works. So you have this finite supply of gold, there is this value that is known, and then there's a series of distributed blockchain ledgers globally in different nodes that can verify the one-to-one gold to Bitcoin that exists and that is being transacted on around the world. So then nobody has to carry around gold, silver, platinum, palladium, because it can probably, it's just maybe not the best way to do things, especially if you're making huge purchases like B2B, you got business to business stuff going on. People are making really large transactions. Maybe the gold has to travel across an ocean. Like, are you going to put it in a boat that gets terrible fuel efficiency, or are you going to put it in a plane, which is probably an even worse idea, to raise a bunch of heavy gold into the air and fly it around, and then other planes would be flying gold from the opposite direction back. So then you're going to try to do a net wash. You end up with things that are like so complicated and confusing that if it were just digital, as long as everybody had electricity, then the gold can stay where it is. And then the one-to-one backing to the Bitcoin can be the essentially like the dollars that you keep in your wallet right now, except they will the value is ensured, the integrity can be confirmed, it can be infinitely verified as many times as you want. You will always arrive at the same number. And if you don't, that's when the notebook that's trying to cook the books can be revealed, exposed, and rejected. So it can provide continuity to this system.
Right. But then as soon as that gold is, see, the problem is that it really only works one way. And so, like the gold and silver, even though it's stamped, it can be verified and all that kind of stuff. If it's stolen, it's gone. And your Bitcoin is still floating out there with its
Mm.
keys transacting. There's no physical mechanism in which you could just delete the dollar. You can't just delete the gold and the Bitcoin at the same time. So that's why I'm
They're
thinking
not
like
okay. Yeah, they're not
it's still highly
intrinsically
problematic.
tied.
Yeah, it's still highly problematic because they will never ever be physically tied in the same way as just a commodity is in your possession. And I think like
You're right.
what you brought up though was some really interesting points too, because like what I want people to think about, and you did with such an excellent example about talking about flying gold around. It's like, yeah, you would actually make international trade a lot more costly. Oh my God, isn't that like the entire point of what we want to do anyway? Like we're if we're drowning in um, having these pollutants in our atmosphere from all of this international trade and constant machinery functioning on, you know, some could say pointless transactions. Isn't it like this is exactly how things should work? It should be local. It should be, slow. We don't want to initiate fraud by playing a ridiculous float game in which you have thousands upon thousands of electronic transactions trying to all talk to each other on a ledger that'll just be unwound later on in the actual accounting side when funds are moved back and forth.
Settlement since 1913 on the balance sheet from the Federal Reserve's creation still has not been performed
Look,
because
like in money laundering practices, there's such a thing as rapid movement of funds. Why? Because once it's taken out, it's gone. It's really hard. You would have to go and physically catch them. As soon as you withdraw all of the money from your account in cash and run away, law enforcement has to go find you. It's not enough to just like put a lock on your account anymore. They have to go
hmm,
find you and physically take back your money or the money that was, let's say, illegally gained and then washed through the system. No, it's, one, it's a lot harder to do that with gold. You can't just like transfer gold a bunch of times from a bunch of different accounts, withdraw it at a single location, and then run away with it. You might as well just go steal that gold directly from where it was, which is why back in the day it was such a big deal that banks were robbed or train cars, all of these different transportation vehicles, which I prefaced before. We have better technology in that sort of security field now, and I feel like that just adds to gold's value, because we're able to install cameras and watch things. We have bank systems that allow us to double check the gold and not the other way around. We shouldn't be you know worrying so much about the math that we forget to count the gold. The gold is the important thing.
ooh, I like that phrase.
So no
It's
matter
your
how mathematically beautiful any of these Bitcoin equations are, unfortunately, I still think that they fail in the fact that in reality, now the gold is either there or it's not. And Bitcoin, it's I'm glad that they were able to play these games and really create like a strong system that has a certain amount of utility. There's no doubt about that. I think even having something like contracts on general ledgers just to make sure everyone knows what's going on. You could do receipts on ledgers and make sure that you don't lose anything anymore in that way. You can open up transparency in that way. So the applications of the blockchain are fantastic and will definitely be used in our society. Transacting it for money still doesn't seem to me to be the most valuable way of using that technology.
it's your good points, and I think that it's probably likely that there will be some sort of coalescence of a digital form of money, of which Bitcoin seems to be in the lead. Like it's they're being interviewed for this position, and so far it's got the best resume. Doesn't mean it's like the overall optimal choice. But I also don't see people long term carrying around tiny bits of silver or gold. I think that it's almost like transacting with the physical substance, like owning the physical substance, I think is very likely. Transacting in it, I think, is less likely, other than some sort of transition period. Like, let's just say there's this apocalyptic event, uh, the grid goes down situation, and stuff hits the fan. It's a great, reliable way to do things, but it's also, I don't think, a long term solution. Like, if I envision the future after that, like a post apocalyptic world, technology is like rediscovered, or people read books and figure out how to reconstruct like the electrical grid and planes, trains, automobiles, like the George Jetson, like this futuristic world. I just don't see those people also using gold and silver, like pulling it out of their pocket or their wallet to pay for things. So
I have
there's
a few.
something.
Yeah, no, I'm glad you brought that up because I do think that there are some excellent ways that we can use and conceptualize both of these concepts together. And that's something like Dave and Buster's. At Dave and Buster's, you go and you get a prepaid card that you load with your money ahead of time, turns it into a form of a credit that you then get to spend on food and drink and all sorts of different stuff inside the facility. So I think what you
Okay.
can do is you could have these banking institutions where you have banking as a service. You're still like having gold and silver to turn in per se. It doesn't have to be, but like you can have like a fiat layer on top. I'm just saying that this fiat layer will always be unstable. You will always have, because you can um, more or less make money out of thin air, which is what, like, there's no way to guarantee, I think, any sort of money and still inherently make it valuable. If you have just the potential to create like a form of currency on a computer, I don't think that anything that digital is quite the same worthwhile as anything physical will ever be.
That would make
I,
sense. It has to correspond to something that has value. So then that goes into the question of like, what is value? Well, value is something that ensures continuity of life or otherwise advances it.
or has
Has to be
scarcity.
useful.
Yep, just like so like what I'm saying is that if you want to go to different places, let's say on the planet, and have your gold, well, one, I mean, like, there's also this realism of just like you can go anywhere on this planet right now and be killed very easily by anyone. There's no guarantee. If there's no guarantees in life, I don't know why we would want, or how do we expect guarantees from the monetary system to begin with. So there's like a strange sort of like idealistic fallacy at play as well that I wanted to quickly address before we get into this. But you could also have something that's like a hawala. A hawala has been around for a very long period of time, which is like a temporary fiat setup. So as long as you are making those jumps to fiat smaller and you're not relying on them for long-term asset holder and all that kind of stuff, you could use it temporarily as stopgaps in between. So you could transfer gold and silver into a form of credit and then fly somewhere else. Then as soon as you arrive, then you can get like withdraw gold and silver over there. So your physical gold and silver don't have to travel, and instead is you're operating in a method that people have used for thousands of years.
I like that. I can see that working. It sounds like we're just describing layer one and layer two solutions. There's this underlying foundational layer, the underlying asset that it eventually has to be moved around, but there's this lag, and that's okay because we need that convenience. and the system of credit does sound like it will work. It's like a transformation and improvement upon our current system, as well as the fact that it's backed by something that is finite. And yes, I know you can pull more gold out of the ground, but again, it's such a small percentage of the total gold in circulation, and it's such an energy intensive process that there are also other factors, like we are increasing the value of things that correspond to that value of the gold. So there's a very, very small increasing amount of the underlying asset, but there's also an increasing value that society creates and civilization creates, because there's always the same amount of gold in the earth since humans have been here. But our civilizations are worth much more now than they were back then. If there's just a few makeshift homes from hunter-gatherer tribes originally, and then a lot of gold in the ground. Now we have skyscrapers, internet, electricity, like uh, any number of things, like antibiotics, an entire medical industry, surgery, robots, all that. There's just everything's got to be dynamic and change over time. But I
Yes,
do like your idea
absolutely.
for the credit.
And there's also no reason why we can't just have it all in a certain way. Like there's no reason why we can't just be more what's the word I'm looking for? Like plural in our approach to how we're transacting with everything. Because like there's no reason why there should be a law in place that prevents you from using gold in like medical instruments, even if it is used as money. Like that would just be one of those like autistic rules that you wouldn't need to follow. Like any reasonable human would be able to see that, like, yeah, gold is valuable also for its engineering and um, you know, well, just say engineering applications outside of just being used for money. When it comes to money itself, we don't need to have a cut and dry distinction. We could have a very fluid approach to how we're doing things. We just need to realize that having long term savings in fiat, I think under our current systems, reliant on an energy grid, is a bad long term solution.
For sure,
Because
you just
it,
have a melting ice cube, and
yeah, yeah, exactly.
you have to keep adding. You have a sink and you have a plug in the drain, but it's got a little leak, and you keep having to add water into it just to maintain the same amount, which represents purchasing power. Because when you look at that chart, it's a big decline that starts at 1 and ends at like 0.02, and eventually 0 for all historical fiat currencies. They all go to 0 because they all encounter the same pitfalls and ultimately fail because they just can't adhere to these principles about what
Yeah,
actually links the value of what I have in my hand to anything else.
absolutely. And I think it's also something to be said to address your other earlier point, where our vision of the future doesn't necessarily have to be the future that we ended up pursuing. We can also question and see that that future isn't one that's desirable. I don't want a really quick paced future myself. I don't want this weird dynamism where everything's shooting off in a million different directions and I'm playing bullet hell on Android, trying to dodge just the inescapable amount of information that's constantly being shot at me. I think there's something to be said of like technology could also just include the fact that we're doing the same things with less energy. And so it doesn't have to be that we're using more and more amounts of energy. We could just be using less and less to accomplish the same things and live a more desirable lifestyle. So if that's what we value, that can go back to our other earlier conversation of like what is value? Well, value to me it could also just be like a resort style living situation where I'm able to work not a whole heck of a lot and afford a very, basic lifestyle. And if you want more, you can go and have more, but you're not necessarily artificially limited or forced to expend yourself in such a way that you would have to work long hours into the night just to afford basic food, basic rent, all that kind of stuff. In fact, I think it's going to be the exact opposite, which is why I don't mind having a slower transacting currency like gold and silver, because I'd rather have things work well than work fast with the possibility of it breaking.
I agree. I would rather have things that work well than fast, but I also don't think there's any reason that we can't or shouldn't work towards getting both of those.
Yeah, and it definitely is like a type of preference. I just think that there's also trade-offs that we also need to be aware of. Like, are we going to be like, are you just going to have more drugs to offset all the anxiety of a future, or hopefully just one of us will evolve one day as a human species to be able to absorb just the psychopathic amount of information that's out there that's being bombarded on us, and we'll live in community-free lifestyles in which we're just being jacked off by information constantly. Sounds like a very horrific lifestyle personally, and I think people will find that um, sort of scientific future less Star Trekky and a little bit more brave New Worldy. So
So
I'm
the only I like
good.
that, and I think that just is good, and it just seems to presume that fast is inevitably tied to these negative consequences. Whereas if we could just have finality of settlement, just final settlement early with nothing else, then like I would rather it be fast. Like all else equal, would you rather have something occur quickly or slowly as far as money transactions? So yeah, quickly.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And there's certainly a selling point to that, and that can be used as a form of competition against all these other different systems. I just think that we're entering a form of like there's short-term trade-offs and consequences that lead to a certain strategy, and there are long-term strategies that don't necessarily have to line up with the short run ones. Although what we would see is a long series of short run competitions that end up being the suboptimal approach. So like instead of both of us agreeing to, like, let's say, collude, which would both give us a higher amount of utility, we can just compete against one each other, which is the most realistic aspect if we're going from the classic prisoner's dilemma viewpoint. Then our future will inevitably be suboptimal. So I guess to
Thinking
wrap this
about that.
all, yeah, to wrap this all around, um, maybe gold and silver is the suboptimal approach to the fraud perpetrated that is fiat, but it is a superior approach for longevity.
And it almost at minimum, it's the best, pardon me, best solution that seems to be available. So there may also not be a perfect solution because we live on Earth and we live in an imperfect world. So maybe it's this false assumption that there is this perfect money that can be perfectly accounted for because just life on this planet is dynamic and changes over time. So there's not really anything that's stationary or static over thousands or millions of years, including just like the orbit of the planets.
Yeah, and to give like kind of a tongue-in-cheek approach, and also just to make people laugh, what do you think is more likely? Someone robbing Fort Knox or one billionaire running away with all your Bitcoin?
Ah, that might have been it. Yeah, I don't know because we also don't actually know if Fort Knox actually has all that gold. No one's ever audited them. And apparently, when we do government audits, we find out that trillions of dollars are missing.
You provide a really great counterexample there. But it also shows that even with Fort Knox, if that's what you can't really trust anyone else with your money, which used to be, like a form of financial responsibility that people used to value. uh, outside of our millennial generation, where because we know we're dealing with monopoly money, we seem to be cynical about it instead of trying to do anything about it. Which is why I'm not saying necessarily that you should hold all your gold at Fort Knox, that you should hold your gold yourself because you should be responsible for your own money. And if
Mm.
that disappears, then that's life. Like I could say that someone else stealing your gold is wrong, and I would be right, but it doesn't also make that gold come back. It's just life is a series of games like that, and we're trying to figure out collectively, in some ways, how do we optimize for certain strategies, and how do we diminish some of those negative ones. But the fact that all these different crypto platforms have just collapsed so quickly, like we didn't even have fucking 5 years of this stuff, right? Like all of this stuff is like developed in the last like few years. I'm sorry, not 5 years. Maybe I should go. We haven't had 10 years of this shit. We've had gold for thousands of years and it's still around.
And all
Because
of a
like
sudden,
thieves don't want to destroy gold. They just want to run away with it and use it. But once that gold's used, it's also circulating in the system again. It doesn't leave.
that's a really good point. And then we entered the wild cyber west. It was just this explosion of like some 20,000 so-called cryptocurrencies and other weird forms of digital assets. And then most of that has imploded. Most of them have essentially gone to or gotten close to zero, have not stood the test of time any by any standard except maybe how long a fly lives on that order, because they rose so quickly and collapsed so profoundly. um, I guess it just brings up a lot of great questions, especially for
Fiat.
anybody in the audience. If they think, well, what is the solution? You can't hold it all yourself, or you could, but there are risks. And there are risks if you let other organizations hold on to it, whether centralized or partially decentralized. And other times you almost have to trust that they just have it, like Fort Knox. If enough people just believe that they have all this gold that's still there, that has never been touched, or nobody skimmed any off the top, maybe they added to it, I don't know, but we can't verify it. So we trust, but don't verify. How do we trust and verify and mitigate risk and have a way to transact in value that is beneficial for everybody, that works and stands the test of time?
So the tongue in cheek thing I was referring to before, if people didn't catch on, I'm not actually not saying the difference between gold held in the Federal Reserve or at Fort Knox is any different from those cryptocurrency platforms. They're actually both the same phenomenon because the gold that's stored at Fort Knox is used for fiat. It's not like it's equally distributed to any individual. So like that was my sort of joke moment, at least for myself, and I thought it was entertaining, so I wanted to pass along. But I also want to explain the joke a little bit for people who didn't catch on, and it could also just be that I had failed at the joke, but which is the more likely explanation. But just in case, this is one of those things that's confusing about like having the difference between having a gold backed dollar and having gold is pretty big because you do have to have that sense of trust. So even if you have a cryptocurrency that's backed by gold, it's still cryptocurrency, and he who holds the gold makes the rules. I don't think that has changed, unfortunately, throughout our history on the planet. And once more, I think the way that we see financial asset wealth management easily applies here. A lot of these same sorts of rules apply. You want to diversify. You want to have some gold on hand. You want to have some gold in the bank. You want to have investments in some of these other things. You want to diversify your ties to things so you're not just held up in one location or the other. The sort of like idea that we have to centralize and make sure the centralized thing is unbreakable is like we're making this golden bull that cannot be tabooed against and must be worshipped at all cost. instead of doing like the financially responsible thing, which is to diversify as much as you can. Have some gold, have some silver. Go out and make sure that some of your friends have some of your gold and you have some of theirs. And you're making these different sorts of systems that are anti-fragile by making them decentralized. And you could do this with real assets. You could own different types of property. You could bury your gold on some of them. I don't know. You can do whatever you want.
It's a very good resource allocation situation to consider that would have to be fairly tailored to the individual. But one thing's for sure, what we don't want to happen is the government is holding all the gold and you're left standing just holding on to rectangles that are made of cotton with some green and black ink on them. Who has
Absolutely.
the
This is a
value there?
fantastic segue into the general explanation of like why are central banks doing this in the first place. Well, it's because the fiat themselves, the fiat itself is a benefit to the government. And that's why it was implemented in the first place. It was a fraud perpetrated against the American people. And you could say this for any government that has a centralized bank using fiat, that any government engaging in that behavior is engaging in fraud, and they're forcing their people to transact in a way that isn't free, that isn't sustainable, and only benefits the apparatus at large. So, when you say that, like, oh, they invented this fiat because it benefits the people, it does not. And if you do not have an understanding that government will do things that it's incentivized and or self-interested to pursue, then I don't think you understand what's going on. It's just made up of people, and those people have their own competing goals. So
It's
if
very
you want to
true.
protect yourself and you want to protect your own assets, then you have to take responsibility for yourself. And I think that's like the great gift of what America is. And so I think it needs a monetary system that matches.
Instead of the very definition of fiat, which means it is because it is decreed by the government.